All right, we are picking back up where we left off from part one with part two here in the nervous system. As you saw in the intro, a great way to test your knowledge is to take out a blank piece of paper and, without looking at the PowerPoint or the book or help from your friends, try to write down as much as you can remember in 5 minutes. Whatever you can't remember, go back, look at it, learn it, try again until you can write down everything in 5 minutes. Might be scribbles on a piece of paper. But as we get into the overview of the nervous system, we can see here it's primarily focused on the brain, the spinal cord, and the nerves traveling out from the body. So this is a great picture of just the nervous system, often shown in yellow, traveling through the body. And without the nervous system, the body would not do what it does. So the nervous system is a huge dictator of what the body does. And it's broken down into 2 different divisions: a central nervous system, brain, spinal cord; peripheral nervous system, the nerve fibers, and what we call peripheral nerves traveling out to, let's say, the hand or the arm. So these would be peripheral nerves here. And then the big one is the spinal cord, and the brain would be central. Those can further be broken down into somatic and autonomic as well. But looking at a specific neuron, so neuron is similar to a muscle fiber, so like one cell within that system, and it's a functional unit, and it's going to propagate that action potential that you learned about in 1700 and 1710 down the neuron and the nerve itself to whatever muscle or organ that it innervates. So we're going to focus heavily on the synapse of the axon coming down in the cell body, and then synapsing with another neuron, propagating that signal. And here's a great shot of central versus nervous. And I'm harping on this difference because clinically, if we see a certain deficit in, let's say, the reflexes, it will tell us whether there's been damage to the central nervous system or the peripheral nervous system. For example, if you're doing a reflex on So if you're doing a reflex test on, let's say, your elbow, and the doctor hits it and it doesn't do anything, that's indicative of an issue with the peripheral nervous system. But if you do the same thing and your arm has a huge reflexive response, that's indicative of an issue with the central nervous system. So this reflex test relates back to the anatomy of the nervous system that we're going to look at here. And here you can see the central nervous system, brain, spinal cord. It's all about integration and coordination. And the spinal cord actually does some integrating of stimuli coming in. And damage to these are often fatal and often irreversible, to where if you have damage to that nervous tissue specifically, then you cannot regenerate it. The regrowth does occur, let's say after a stroke or something like that, with the astrocytes or other cells that can connect these things, but not the specific neurons themselves. Here's a cross section. So this would be a transverse view of the spinal cord. And when you do that, you see just the inside of it. So this is a vertebral column here. Imagine just cutting it like this with the spinal cord inside, and this is what you see. Now we've got a nucleus, we've got different tracts, gray matter, white matter. There's a video down here, the spinal cord model, that will help break down all this stuff in this picture. But just to summarize, you've got a two-way street of the nervous system. And what that means is, let's say on your skin, you've got receptors, and these receptors pick up, let's say, light touch. And that would be like this green one here, traveling through the posterior side to the spinal cord, and then the other way of the street would be back out the anterior side to the skin. So you can go in, you go out of the spinal cord, it's a two-way street. Same thing with like a muscle contraction on this side. That process, if it occurs involuntarily, is called a reflex arc. Check out this video at the top left of how to draw a reflex arc, as this could be something that's required on your exams. Keeping it going with the central nervous system, it is so sensitive and so detrimental if it's damaged. And we know there's a lot of bones, let's say the vertebrae, surrounding the spinal cord, lots of protection, as well as the skull surrounding the brain. But in between bone and the actual spinal cord are some things called meninges or meninges. And essentially what these are protective layers surrounding the brain and the spinal cord to protect the bone from the nervous tissue. So I often will refer to these as like saran wrap or tin foil or some sort of protective layer that you might put around something so that friction does not occur. And there's actually some spaces and gaps and fluid that also cushion that area. So check out the Meninges model video to see all those layers of the central nervous system. And of course, we've got the brain. We're going to get into the brain later on as well. Brain is so amazing. We know, or scientists in the world know, maybe 1% out of 100 of what the brain does and how it does it. So if you're interested in neuroscience, there is a lot to figure out with the brain. So I highly encourage anyone interested in neuroscience to continue on. The brain also has nerves coming off of it. These are called cranial nerves. So cranial nerves are different from peripheral nerves, but they act in very similar ways to where they branch off from the brain to different things. For example, the olfactory nerve, which is made up of the olfactory bulb and the olfactory tract, goes to your nose. And clinically, it's important to know these cranial nerves for things like cranial nerve testing. For example, a patient might come into the hospital, and if you want to test if the olfactory nerve has been damaged, and you know this is for the sense of smell, you'd have the patient close one nostril, hold up something smelly, have them close their eyes, and see if they can smell it. Now, if they can smell it out of one nostril, but not the other, that one nostril could have a damaged olfactory nerve. And again, relating the function to the form. So form is that it is near the nose, it goes into the nose, and that gives it the function of smell. And we'll learn all these later on. Continuing on though, a nerve or peripheral nerve is actually a bunch of neurons kind of lined up and packed together, very, very similar to a muscle fiber. And as you can see here, it almost looks like the same exact picture. So if I were to come in and do the draw here as well, we can tell there are three main layers of the nerve. And funny enough, it's got the same prefixes, epi, peri, and endo, but the only thing that changes is the final part, the nerium. So nerium, we're talking about nerve instead of mycium, which would be muscle. But it's got the peripheral nerve up here, and then bundles of those neurons would be a fascicle. And then you pull out one nerve fiber, and that's what we have here. So the power of three, you're seeing it again. Keeping it going, let me get rid of, here's a gift, and you can see it in your PowerPoint. The propagation speeds are different to whether it's myelinated or unmyelinated. So the myelination is here on the left, and there's no myelination over here. Myelination means fast. No myelination, slow. They're both fast, but super fast would be myelination, just normal fast speed, unmyelination. So something like multiple sclerosis is the breakdown of this myelin sheath, which affects the nervous system and the speed that it can propagate those signals. Moving on, second time you've seen this picture, you're going to see it quite a bit more. So if you don't know how to draw out a reflex arc in the spinal cord, definitely go back and watch that video. Use that study technique of trying to draw it out yourself. If you miss one of the parts, go back, rewatch it, try again until you get it guaranteed on the exam. But here we can see just different aspects to it. I want to add in the fact that there are things called rami. So if the spinal cord is here and the peripheral nerves come out, in order to get to, let's say, your arms or your chest or your back, it has to travel out from that spinal nerve via the rami. Ramus is singular, rami, plural. And posterior ramus would go to, let's say, your back and innervate muscle or skin. The anterior ramus, front arms, legs, things like that. So the anterior ramus goes to more locations, so it's thicker. The posterior ramus only goes to the back. So notice how the posterior ramus is smaller in size to the anterior ramus. Function follows form. If the form is bigger, typically it has more function or more purpose or more things packed into that. Another key one to note is the spinal ganglion, also called the dorsal root ganglion, the DRG. It's a bubble where the cell bodies are for these neurons. So again, function follows form. I'll say that probably 100 times this summer. If it's a bubble, it's got more in it than just the neuron. It's got the cell bodies that produces that bubble. Keeping it going, another video of a different look at the spinal cord model showing those rami, so definitely check that video out. But here's a great picture of extending it to the muscle and the skin. So oftentimes a picture will not do the whole nervous system justice because you can't see where it goes. But here you can see from the spinal cord, the signal could come out and then continue to travel. These would be the rami to muscle or skin. Now, if it goes to muscle, it's a myotome. If it goes to skin, it's a dermatome. And what that means is it's just innervating either skin or muscle. And in this case, it's sensory information. So pain, temperature, touch, pressure, all those sorts of things that you have receptors for in your skin and your muscle. Let's focus on dermatome, because dermatome is a test that you might do in the hospital in order to test for a spinal nerve. So again, the amazing thing about knowing the anatomy and what it does is that you can track it backwards to figure out what's been damaged. So here we can see all the dermatomes. Dermatomes is an area of skin innervated by a specific spinal nerve. So for example, your shoulder is spinal nerve C4. That's cervical. Number 4, we'll get to all those numbers, but just know it's a specific level of your spinal cord. Now, if a patient could not feel light touch on C4 or on their shoulder, they could have damage to that the sensory component of peripheral nerve C4, right? Lots of words. Basically, they say if you can't feel it, you probably got damage at that level of the spinal cord. And a patient will never come into the hospital and say, oh my gosh, my spinal nerve C4 has been damaged. Like they don't know that, but they will come in and say, I can't feel my shoulder. I can't feel my thumb or whatever it might be. And you, as a medical professional, have to figure out what's been damaged in order to treat it. So a video down here where I actually draw some of these dermatomes on my own arm. So check that out. Just another look at a myotome here. Again, this is different than the alpha motor neuron, but this is just innervating the muscle, so myomuscle. As we continue on, we get into the different subdivisions of the nervous system. This one looking at the autonomic nervous system. Autonomic, automatic is how I like to think about it. Like your heart is involuntary. And with this, we've got the two main systems, sympathetic and parasympathetic. Sympathetic, you've probably heard fight or flight. This is going to ramp things up. Heart rate goes up, breathing goes up, sweating might occur. Your pupils dilate, like you are ready to fight or you're ready to run. When I run a race, what I'm trying to do in the warm-up is get my sympathetic nervous system firing so that my heart rate's up and my lungs are breathing and I can get energy for that race. Parasympathetic is the opposite. So now we're talking about bringing things down. It's the rest or digest. We have a big meal, maybe Thanksgiving, and afterwards you are digesting all that food. That's the parasympathetic nervous system at work doing that digestion, and they kind of counter one another. Here's a table. I do not expect you to memorize this table, but it just shows you a few things of what the sympathetic versus parasympathetic does. For example, in the eyes, sympathetic, fight or flight, they dilate, which means they're going to let more light into the eyes. Why would that happen? Well, when you're ready to fight or flight, you want to see more things, right? Whereas rest or digest, parasympathetic, maybe you're going to fall asleep. You want to constrict your eye and let less light into it. So when you get into human physiology, these are type of tables that you'll have to memorize. Human anatomy, I just want you to understand kind of where we're going with learning these things and learning the anatomy. So up until this point, we talked about the central nervous system being the brain and the spinal cord, and then the peripheral nervous system as these nerves coming off at each level. And I like to think of it as the spinal cord is kind of like an elevator that goes up and down. But the question is, how does that occur? Well, here we're going to look at the spinal tracts. So within the spinal cord, you have different tracts, and there's certainly much more than just 3 of them, but we're going to look at the 3 main tracts of the spinal cord. And what's going on here is we have 2 that go up and 1 that goes down. And let's look at the ascending ones first. By ascending, we're talking about the dorsal columns. So this area that's most posterior, dorsal means posterior, on the spinal cord is going to take any light touch or pressure up to the brain. So let's say on my arm, I feel a mosquito, and it's a light touch sensor that gets activated. That's going to send it up my arm over to my spinal cord, and then at that point, it's going to jump on to the dorsal column and travel up to my brain. And in my brain, there's a specific spot for this spot on my arm to tell me that I'm feeling light touch on my arm. Now, if that signal does not get up to my brain, I will not feel it. It has to get up to the brain to be processed in this case. Now, that's also true for pain and temperature. But pain and temperature uses what's called the spinal thalamic tract. These 2 right here. Spinal thalamic, a little bit more lateral and anterior. But there's another one that's descending from the brain down, and that's the corticospinal. Now that's motor movement. And we said earlier in part 1, hopefully you got this as part 1, that skeletal muscle is voluntarily contracted. So in your brain, there's a spot that initiates movement of, let's say, your fingers. So if you want to make a fist, it goes from your brain down to the spinal cord, down the corticospinal tract to the level of my fingers, travels out, innervates it, motor unit, alpha motor neuron, and all of the muscle fibers it innervates and contracts. If it does not travel down, it cannot do that. So again, you're starting to see there's different pathways and patterns for things to be initiated by the nervous system in the brain and the rest of the body. Here's a great shot of it as well, but this is showing a different component. So this is showing the sympathetic movement. So before we kind of talked about light touch and movement, but what if you want to talk about the sympathetic nervous system? Well, there's something called the sympathetic trunks. And if your spinal cord, these guys right here are like the elevators of the spinal cord. There's also staircases. So notice how these are outside the vertebral column. So these are lateral or superficial to the spinal cord. And they act as staircases for signals of the sympathetic nervous system. So there's one at each level of the spinal cord. And this is a summary, these four right here, of how you might initiate the sympathetic response. For now, just know elevators and staircases are different ways to travel up and down the spinal cord. We will get into this more in the nervous system PowerPoint. And to kind of conclude this PowerPoint, we just want to say that's an overview, but we're going to talk about digestive system. We're going to talk about the respiratory system. We're going to talk about the urinary system and reproductive, male and female reproductive systems as well. And can't forget about the endocrine system as it relates to all those organs. And the tissues and the integumentary as well. And that concludes the intro lecture 1 PowerPoint slideshow. This was part 2. Go back, review. Again, you're going to see all that again, but this is a great overview to get you started on pages 1 through 42 in your book. Be ready in the professional team, small groups, to answer a lot of extra, additional, deeper level questions. So come with questions on the PowerPoint, but be ready for some exam-like challenge questions as well. All right, thanks for watching and have a nice day.